So hopefully folks are here for the Summer Pride Leadership Series. This is the second workshop in the series. So tonight we're doing PEP, PrEP, and U equals U workshop as the first part, and then we're moving into a panel of lived expertise on HIV then and now. So hopefully everyone's in the right place. And before we get started today, we just wanted to start with a land acknowledgement, talk a little bit about where we are and some of the connections between the history and ongoing stuff that's happening on the land and HIV, which is what we're here to talk about today. So I mentioned that my name is Taylor. My pronouns are they, them. And I'm currently on the territory of the Malahat Nation, kind of right on the border between Malahat Nation and Cowichan tribe, so kind of somewhere in between there, which is otherwise known as Mill Bay. And you can kind of see it in the map. It's just kind of at the top of that square on the map. You can see in the expanded view too that Marshall has up there. Yeah, so super grateful to live and be working on these lands as someone of settler heritage. So yeah, my family is Scottish, English, Irish, and German descent. Settler heritage, uninvited guests on these territories. Yeah. Marshall, did you want to?
Sure, yeah. So yeah, I'm Marshall and I use he, him, his pronouns. And I'm here on the land of the Chichen Itza family of the Lekwungen speaking people, which is also kind of overlapping fringes of the Quisepsum, Shianu, and Suk territories, otherwise known as the West Shore or Langford. And yeah, I am also a white settler heritage of Irish and English descent.
Yeah. So we just wanted to make a connection, talking about the land that we're on and the history and ongoing displacement of Indigenous folks from this land, on this land that we're on. We wanted to link that between what we're talking about today, which is HIV. And we know that Indigenous people are overrepresented in terms of HIV. So just to give you a sense of some of the numbers, as of 2016, Indigenous people made up 4.9% of the population of so-called Canada, but 11% of all new HIV infections, right? So pretty significant overrepresentation there. And we know that that's directly linked to colonization, by which I mean a long and ongoing history of violence, displacement of people from the land, genocide on the part of the Canadian government and settler folks, right? That has caused those elevated numbers and overrepresentation of Indigenous folks in terms of living with HIV. Yeah. Anyone want to add anything to that, or any feedback about it, or anything you want to say?
I would just add, as far as the overrepresentation of Indigenous folks with HIV as well, like, colonization and the ways that plays out in our medical system and the barriers that adds to, getting appropriate education and access to treatment about, health concerns like HIV and, as well as like, just systemic racism within the medical industrial complex.
Okay. Sweet. So, so just for the purposes of this workshop today, we kind of wanted to suggest some kind of guidelines for how we might be when we're in this virtual space together. So we've got a few. The first one is what's said here stays here, what's learned here leaves here. So we definitely hope that you're going to take the knowledge and the learnings from this workshop, you know, into your life. We hope that you're going to share them with other people in your life. You know, that's the reason why we do this, is to get the information out there. And so we certainly want you to take that with you. And at the same time, you know, people are going to be sharing from their own lived experiences, talking about things that are super personal, and we want to remember to be really respectful and honor that by not sharing other people's stories in a way that like links that story to them outside of this workshop, right?
And just to interject on that point, it's, I guess, a little bit different because we're recording this session, but just so folks know, if there's anything that you want to say that you don't want recorded, just let us know and we can pause the recording, or we can edit it out afterwards. So
absolutely. Yeah. Okay, another big one is don't yuck my yum. So, you know, if anyone's sharing about something that, like, typically this comes up around like sexual practices, right? It's something that they're into, something that's nice for them. We don't want to express judgment for anything like that, right? Or like, or perpetuate stigma in any way by like saying that something's gross that someone's into or anything like that. Okay, the next one is ouch, oops. So that's just kind of a model just for the purpose of this workshop for dealing with conflict should it arise. So if someone says something that rubs you the wrong way, doesn't quite sit right with you, one way to address it would just be to be like, you know, ouch, like, you know, that doesn't sit well with me. And we would invite the person who has said that comment to respond with an oops, right? Just, I'm sorry. Just as a kind of model for handling conflict within this context. Okay, one diva, one mic. So we've asked folks, you know, to mute yourselves if you're not speaking. So that takes care of that to some extent. But we don't want to be talking over each other. Marshall's laughing because I said topping. We don't want to be topping over each other in this workshop. So yeah, try not to interrupt each other. Sometimes that's a little bit inevitable with Zoom, just because you can't necessarily see or like have cues about when someone's going to speak like you can in person, but just do your best. Give everybody their airtime. Take care of your needs, which is hopefully also a little bit easier with Zoom. If you have to go to the bathroom, if you need to get up and stretch, we won't even know that you're doing it if you have your video turned off. So please feel free to do that. Make sure that you're, you know, hydrated, that you have adequate snacks, you know, whatever you need in order to feel good. We want you to prioritize that. Step forward, step back. So if you find that you're, you know, asking a lot of questions, you're super eager, that's awesome. We love that. And we also want to make sure to have enough time and space so that everyone can ask questions should they desire. So yeah, if you notice that you're taking up a lot of airtime with your questions, just giving other people the chance to speak also. And then respect for pronouns. So yeah, we're using the pronouns that people share with us that they go by. And if you screw it up, say the wrong pronoun, that's okay. You just say, oh, sorry. use the right pronoun and then move on, or accept correction if someone is generous enough to offer you that correction in the group. So it doesn't need to be a big deal. Just acknowledge it and move on. Sound cool? Okay.
Good.
All right. Is there anything else anybody wanted to add or clarification on? No? Okay.
No.
And feel free to use the chat if there's anything that you wanna add.
Mm-hmm. Oh, also, if folks need, there's subtitles available, closed captioning. Down at the bottom, there should be an option to select closed captioning and then show subtitles. So if that's something that you want, you can go ahead and do that too.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so obviously you're all here to talk about HIV and specifically PEP, PrEP, and U equals U, and then for an exciting follow-up conversation with our lovely panelists about HIV Then and Now. And so for the purposes of this presentation, we're kind of assuming that you already know a little bit about HIV. It's not necessarily like an HIV basics presentation. So if there's anything that you want to know more about as far as HIV basics or whatever, just reach out to Taylor or I. Taylor, if you want to put our email addresses maybe in the chat, and we can line you up with an HIV basics presentation.
Yeah, we're gonna go through it. We're gonna go through some HIV basics, but it's gonna be super fast.
Yeah. Yeah. So the plan for today is to, as we just said, a quick review of HIV basics. And then Taylor's going to talk a bit about HIV treatment and U equals U. So that's undetectable equals untransmittable. And we're going to talk more about that later. And then we're going to talk about PrEP and various aspects of PrEP as far as effectiveness, use, risks, how to get it, etc. And PEP. And then we're going to take a bit of a break. And then folks can come back for the HIV Then and Now panel. Does that sound like a good plan? All right. So before we kind of dive too far into this, we just wanted to make a note about language, and specifically language about bodies. So we talked about pronouns and how it's important to respect people's pronouns, but you know, different people have different language use around their bodies, particularly folks who are trans or intersex or like have different relationship with their bodies. A lot of cis folks have different words that they like to use for their bodies as well. And so we just wanted to be a little bit more clear about the kinds of language that we're going to use, as well as like what relative risks are associated with different body parts. And so today we're kind of going to talk about what we would call innies, or some folks might consider like a vagina or a front hole. And that's just the fleshy genitals that have a hole. So we might refer to that as an innie, just as like an umbrella term that is a little more gender neutral. And then there's outies, which is some folks might refer to as the penis, or some trans folks might refer to as like the clit or the strapless. And we're talking about the fleshy genitals that stick out, that might be used to penetrate a hole. And then we're going to talk about butts. So innies, outies, and butts. Unfortunately, like some of you might be aware, there's not a lot of research on STI risk for trans and intersex bodies, and that's really unfortunate. But just some general general factors to consider are for outies, that the highest risk is associated with outies that produce fluids or ejaculate. But there isn't a lot known for like trans folks who are assigned female at birth on bottom surgeries like phalloplasty and metoidioplasty. And then as far as butts go, butts are higher, generally a higher risk activity, doing butt stuff for sexually transmitted bloodborne infections than innies are. But there's not a lot known about, like, for example, atrophy of the innie or the front hole or vagina in folks who are assigned female at birth, or folks who are, say, postmenopausal, or yeah, on testosterone. And then there's not a lot known about folks who are assigned male at birth and vaginoplasty. So again, this is just something that there's not a lot known about. We need to name it now before we head into this conversation. And if some of this sort of gender body language stuff is kind of over the head right now, we are going to be having a conversation about Gender 101 on August 17th. So you should come and check it out. Does that all make sense, sort of?
Makes sense to me, Marshall.
Cool.
Okay, so super quick little HIV basics refresher. Thinking about the letters HIV, those letters stand for human immunodeficiency virus. So key points here, it's a human virus, and so it's only passed between people. And then we have AIDS, which might require another click there.
Couple more clicks.
A couple more. So acquired immune deficiency syndrome. So hopefully you were saying that along with me at home. So AIDS is a stage in HIV infection that can develop with time, not something that can be caught. And the relationship between them, so HIV can kind of lay the groundwork for AIDS to happen later in a situation where someone's immune system fails and other infections or illnesses can show up. And people who are HIV positive and don't have AIDS, are not living with AIDS, are sensitive about the word AIDS and often offended by the incorrect usage of that word. So yeah, just to be super clear, one is the virus and one is the syndrome, and not everyone will get the syndrome. And indicators are things like immune cell count, and yeah, so just to be really clear, this slide that Marshall has up now, we want to be really sure that we say what we mean. So when we're referring to HIV, we want to use the word HIV and not use the word AIDS. AIDS is something that still carries a lot of stigma, and it's just inaccurate, right, to use the word AIDS when what we actually mean is the human immunodeficiency virus. So this is a really cool project called the Stigma Project, which we have in the resource document that we'll give you at the end of this presentation. They've got a lot of really awesome like graphics and yeah, really cool stuff about stigma and HIV and AIDS. Okay. Yeah, so HIV is a virus that attacks the CD4 cells in the immune system, and we need our immune system to fight off infection and diseases. When HIV attacks the CD4 cells, it damages the ability to initiate an immune response. In the case of HIV, CD4 cells are the host cells that aid HIV in replicating itself. So it uses those cells to make copies of itself, and in doing that, it destroys the cells. The fewer functioning CD4 cells a person has, the weaker the immune system, and therefore the more vulnerable a person is to infections and illness. If a person has less than 200 CD4 cells, their immune system is becoming very weak, and they can become sick with what are called opportunistic infections. And then the next slide. So AIDS, on the other hand, is a collection of different illnesses that HIV positive folks can get if and when their immune system fails, right? So people can recover from an AIDS diagnosis if they have access to good health care and treatments. And when people have access to HIV treatment, generally speaking, AIDS never develops. So it's not something that most people here in so-called Canada ever experience. Those who are living with HIV without knowing their status, so folks who are undiagnosed, are the most likely to experience the decrease in immune function that can lead to the development of AIDS. But as I mentioned before, when people get access to treatment, then that can effectively be reversed, right? So generally, like, people are living with HIV, and that's something that where there isn't a vaccine or a cure per se for HIV, but there are very few people in so-called Canada who are living with AIDS nowadays. Does that make sense? Yeah, okay. Okay. So how do you transmit HIV? So the first thing you need is a body fluid that contains HIV. Does anyone want to throw either in the chat or by unmuting themselves what some of those body fluids might be?
Blood.
Blood, yeah. Thanks, Don. Yeah, so blood's one of them. Butt juice, thank you, Shay. My favorite. So rectal fluid or butt juice. So that's not poop or feces, but that's the actual like lubrication. Your rectum secretes a small amount of lubrication on its own, and that's the butt juice that Shay is referring to. Any other ones?
Spit.
Not spit. No.
No.
No spit.
Spinal fluid?
Spinal fluid. Thank you, Piot. That's another one of my favorites. So it's probably not super relevant to most folks unless you're, you know, like a neurosurgeon, or you're one of those lovely creatures from like Alien versus Predator. Probably you don't have to worry too much about coming into contact with anyone's spinal fluid, hopefully. But it's a fun one for sure. Yeah, semen, thank you. Beautiful. Okay, so Marshall, feel free to unveil the next slide. So yeah, the body fluids that we're talking about, got blood, sex fluids basically, so pre-cum, cum, innie/vaginal/front hole fluid, anal secretions, there's our butt juice, spinal fluid, and breast/chest milk. Okay, so no other fluids contain HIV. So that includes tears, sweat, saliva, feces, or urine. Okay, so we need a body fluid containing HIV, and then the next thing we need is an activity that exchanges the fluid. And we'll talk about what those are in a minute. And then we need access to the bloodstream. So mostly, so that's how HIV generally gets access to the bloodstream, is through either a puncture, a cut, a scrape, or a tear, or through wet/leaky cells. So there's some cell layers that it can cross over, even in the absence of like a cut or a tear.
Yeah, so we have a question here about what about mucosal membranes without cuts and tears. So yeah, Taylor, yeah. There we go.
That was a great question though. And we have a really good graphic for that too that we're gonna get to in just like a quick second here. So yeah, in terms of activities that we're talking about that that would provide access to the bloodstream, we're talking about basically sharing injection drug use equipment, and really as far as HIV is concerned, we're talking about sharing needles. So that's one way that HIV could get access to the bloodstream. But sexual transmission of HIV, the things that are considered sort of highest risk are anal sex. So that's sex with an outie and a rectum. And then outie-innie sex, also sometimes referred to as penis-vagina sex. And HIV can be passed through sharing sex toys, and not commonly through giving oral sex on genitals. So that's considered very low risk, but it is possible. And it would be a risk to the person who is getting the sex fluids in their mouth. So typically HIV doesn't cross mucosal membranes in the mouth, but if there are like cuts or tears, or like you have bleeding gums or something in your mouth, then that could potentially represent a risk, and that's why it's low risk as opposed to no risk. But it doesn't typically cross the mucosa inside the mouth. And if you want to go to the next slide there, Marshall, but it can cross some of these mucous membranes. So the lining of the anus or the rectum, the lining of the innie/vagina/front hole, and or the cervix, and then the opening of the penis or the outie, or the skin underneath, like the area underneath the foreskin. It can also cross, as well as inside the urethra. I can't remember if I said that or not, or if I just thought it. Yeah. So those are some of the mucous membranes that it can cross, where there doesn't need to be a cut or tear. It can actually just make its way through those cell layers. And there are a number of things that influence the likelihood of that happening. Things like how much HIV is in the fluid, how long the fluid sits on a given area, the surface area, right? So that's why, and also the thickness of the tissue. So the rectum is made up of fewer layers of cells, and it's a great big surface area in there, right? So it's a lot easier for HIV. HIV has a greater chance of crossing through the rectum, and the rectum is a lot more fragile generally speaking, than front holes are. Although Marshall was mentioning, you know, we don't have data on like how things like atrophy, either from menopause or from if someone is assigned female at birth and is on testosterone, we don't have data on how that impacts HIV transmission risk, really. Any questions about that? Okie dokie.
Cool. So I was just going to talk a little bit about demographics of HIV in BC. And so this is kind of a cumulative chart going from 2008 to 2017. And you can see the various quote unquote risk categories. And the orange there with the squares up at the top is the gay, bi, queer, trans, two-spirit, men who have sex with men category. And so we can see that that's the highest risk out of all the other categories. And then we've got through heterosexual sex, and then through people who use drugs, intravenous drugs, and then there's kind of other and not identified or not known. So it kind of seems to be that the cases for gay, bi, queer, MSM are decreasing over time. But in 2017, which is what this goes up to, 70% of the new HIV infections in BC were amongst gay, bi, queer men who have sex with men. So that's definitely something to keep in mind as we go forward. And so looking a little bit more at the sort of split there. So unfortunately, again, a lot of this research doesn't factor in non-binary folks and trans folks and what that looks like for folks who are kind of not typically meeting these categories. But this gives a breakdown of sort of the risk categories of new infections for men and women. And we can see that by and large, the largest risk category is for the gay, bi, queer men who have sex with men. That's the largest number of newest infections amongst men. And then amongst women, we've got the like heterosexual sex is the largest proportion of new infections, but then a little over half of that is from folks who have come from an HIV endemic country or a country where there's high prevalence of HIV going on. So, you know, that's kind of what we're seeing there. As far as trans folks, again, there isn't a lot of data, but the TransPulse Ontario study, I can't remember what year this data was from, but this was looking at folks from Ontario, and 3% of the trans women reported having HIV, and 0.6% of the trans men reported HIV, but only 46% of any of the folks reported ever being tested for HIV, which is pretty concerning. And there was some more data out of some US studies that showed a bit higher rates. So again, it's kind of with any of this research, there's limitations in, you know, how they're getting participants and how they're reaching into like further marginalized and minority identities, and you know, whether they're reaching people in rural communities and stuff like that. So you know, the data is going to fluctuate a little bit, but within the US there was a study that showed that of folks, or of trans men who had tested for HIV, 3% of those had HIV. And then looking further at trans men who had cis male sexual partners, it was up to 11% had HIV. So definitely that factor of having sex with men increases the risk. And then there was prevalence amongst African American trans men, increased the rate to 7%. Having HIV, and then with trans women, there was 29% of the trans women who were surveyed had who had been tested for HIV had HIV, and that was of 561 trans women from 6 large cities in the US. So again, you know, very disproportionate representation, and something that we need to look at further in our conversations about HIV moving forward. And let's see. So this, again, lovely binary broken down by gender. So we can only imagine where they've put trans folks and non-binary folks, but this is looking at age. We can see that quote unquote men make up much larger proportion of the new HIV infections, at least in 2017. And something that we're seeing is there's been an increase in new infections amongst folks who are under 30, and there's some suspicion that that might be related to having come of age sort of after the initial HIV epidemic, and not maybe being quite so personally affected and aware of the risks involved in strategies for prevention and stuff like that. So yeah. And then breaking down further, looking at, again, binary data on the breakdown in BC of like ethnicity from 2008 to 2017. We can see that sort of the trends that I pulled out of this was that the rates amongst Caucasian folks were decreasing over time, but other ethnicities were staying pretty stable, which kind of goes to show these systemic barriers within the medical system and our public health systems that are just not reaching folks who belong to ethnic minorities. And as Taylor mentioned in the intro, that again, Indigenous people make up 4.9% of the Canadian population in 2016 and represented 11% of the new HIV infections in 2016. So again, there's a disproportionate impact here on particularly Black and Indigenous folks. And we're not seeing a lot of improvement in HIV rates across other ethnic minorities. And that is, again, like results of systemic racism, language barriers, access to culturally competent education around safer sex and substance use, and healthcare and testing and treatment, and all of the above. So looking at some local data, this came from the Sex Now surveys, and this is specifically looking at gay, bi, queer, trans, and two-spirit men who have sex with men. And it was kind of an average from 2015, 2018 to 2019. And there's limitations to this survey, as I already mentioned. You know, some surveys have issues with reaching folks in rural communities, folks who aren't accessing community as well, or community spaces, resources, education networks and stuff like that. So, you know, take it or leave it, but BC had 11.6% on average respondents saying that they had HIV, and that was higher. It was the highest in Canada, the highest province or territory, above the Canadian average of 8.3%. And then we see on the island, that's even higher, particularly for South and North Island. But again, as we drill further into smaller communities, we've got smaller sample sizes, and so fluctuation in numbers might not necessarily be representative of trends, but it's just interesting to look at. So, yeah, next, here we go. So I think, Taylor, you were going to do this part, right?
I am indeed.
Okay.
Yeah, so, okay. So shifting now to talking about some strategies for preventing HIV transmission. I think you can, yeah, sweet. Thanks, Marshall. Go right to the next slide. So yeah, so basically there are 4 strategies that have been identified as highly effective HIV prevention strategies. So the first one, I think most people are aware of, but it's consistent and correct use of condoms. So that can be external or internal. We know that consistent and correct use of condoms greatly reduces risk of HIV transmission happening. That's been well established for some time. We also know consistent and correct use of new harm reduction supplies for injecting drugs, also highly effective at reducing HIV transmission. So particularly, you know, when we're talking about HIV, the harm reduction supplies that we're really talking about are syringes, needles, right? So, you know, if this was a conversation about hepatitis C can be transmitted through sharing a variety of types of equipment for drug use, but with HIV, it's mostly syringes, and that's because of how long HIV lives outside the body versus in the barrel of a syringe. Can live much longer when it's isolated from air. Yeah. And then the other 2, which we're going to get into detail with, that have been identified as highly effective are consistent and correct use of what's called pre-exposure prophylaxis, or PrEP. That's the little blue pill down there in the right corner. And consistent and correct use of treatment by folks who are living with HIV to maintain an undetectable viral load, as represented by the pink and red image in the top corner there. So yeah, we're going to get into details about this, but there are some other harm reduction strategies that, you know, might not necessarily be like quite as effective as these ones, but they're still effective and still worth mentioning for sure. So PEP is considered less effective than the strategies we just talked about, but it's still quite effective. We'll get into more detail about that. Using barriers such as dental dams or gloves for sex. These little flavored condoms are meant to represent like using a flavored condom for oral sex, or making it into a dental dam. Using lube is a really great harm reduction strategy that can reduce risk of HIV transmission. And then there are some other strategies as well, right? So using new tattooing and piercing equipment, that's a really great way of preventing HIV transmission. Addressing other factors that can make it easier for HIV to be passed. So like treating any other STIs that a person is dealing with, or anything else that's causing inflammation. Yeah, all really great strategies. So we'll get into the ones that are some of the newer strategies. So the first one I want to talk about is treatment for HIV, and kind of how that relates to the whole U equals U campaign, or the undetectable equals untransmittable campaign. So with access to treatment, folks with who are living with HIV are living long, healthy lives. HIV treatment usually involves taking a combination of different types of drugs every day, and these drugs work to disrupt the HIV virus's ability to reproduce itself, resulting in fewer and fewer copies of the HIV virus in the body over time. So there are a number of drugs used to treat HIV. These ones here are a couple of them. But treatment is a lot different than it used to be. So some treatment plans involve taking only one pill a day, and these little pictures up here, these are two of what are called the fixed dose combination tablets that are available in Canada to treat HIV. So yeah, some folks only have to take one pill a day, and it's got a bunch of different medications kind of packaged into that one pill. Most people are able to find combinations that work for them with few, if any, side effects nowadays. And they found actually that the sooner that you start treatment, the less likely you are to experience side effects. Yeah, and a lot of people have heard horror stories about HIV treatment, that you have to take, you know, handfuls of pills every day, and that the side effects are awful and really intolerable for folks. But a lot has changed since the beginning. And another thing that has changed is that we no longer wait to get people started on treatment, right? So they've actually found now that starting treatment early decreases the likelihood of a person developing illnesses. And it's just kind of generally better for people's health overall. So people are started on treatment as soon as possible after it's discovered that they're living with HIV. And consistently and correctly taking medications, like taking your treatment for HIV, reduces the amount of HIV in a person's blood and can also result in what's called undetectability, which we're gonna talk more about on the next slide. Okay, so this is just another little statistic. Just in 2016, 86% of Canadians living with HIV were diagnosed. 81% of those people who were diagnosed were on treatment, and 91% of those folks who were on treatment had achieved quote unquote viral suppression, meaning undetectability. And there are a lot of factors that can impact people's access to treatment, right? So as well as people's access to testing, diagnosis, all of those things, right? Not everyone is able to access testing or treatment readily, and the ability of folks to access those things is shaped by a lot of different factors, right? Whether someone is stably housed, whether someone is able to access care that really meets their needs, culturally safe care, things like that, right? It's also it can be a lot harder for folks to access care around HIV when they're living in rural locations or in places where there isn't great access to doctors who are experienced with treating HIV. So yeah, just to kind of get at, you know, we talk a lot about undetectability nowadays, but it's something that's kind of held up as being this really great thing, which it is, and also, you know, it's not always simple for folks, and we want to ultimately uphold people's worth and value, whether or not they're undetectable, and also understand that like getting to that place can be complicated and is not always possible for a lot of really valid reasons, and a lot of reasons that are also you know, that we want to try to change too, if that makes sense.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit more about the U equals U, or undetectable equals untransmittable. So as Taylor mentioned, consistent and correct use of antiretroviral treatments by people with HIV are allowing folks to maintain an undetectable viral load, and it's a highly effective HIV prevention strategy. So again, with these advances in treatment that Taylor talked about, folks can reach a point where the HIV virus in their blood can't be detected on a test, and that's generally defined as less than 200 copies per milliliter of blood. And this is what we call undetectable. So when folks are undetectable, they can't pass HIV to other people through sex. And yeah, there's been a lot of really interesting studies in recent years showing at least 130,000 recorded condomless sex acts between couples where one of the partners was HIV positive and one was HIV negative, and the positive person was, that person who was HIV positive was at undetectable viral load. And there hasn't been any recorded cases of transmission in any of these acts where the HIV positive partner was undetectable. So there's all kinds of really exciting and new evidence being added to this all the time that's consistently showing that folks who are undetectable cannot transmit HIV. And this has been recognized by the World Health Organization and other large governing bodies and stuff. So that's what U equals U is about. And for this strategy to be effective, so you need to be taking your HIV medications consistently, and that's an essential part of it. It usually takes 3 to 6 months to get an undetectable viral load when you first start taking medication. And you'll have to get viral load testing periodically to check the levels of virus in your blood. And then maintaining consistently undetectable viral load is for at least 6 months is necessary to kind of have confidence in your undetectable status being kind of being, I guess, predictable and known over time. And then it's important to visit your healthcare provider regularly for ongoing care and viral load testing as things progress in your treatment. So that was U equals U. So then another prevention, highly effective prevention method is through PrEP, or pre-exposure prophylaxis. And so this has got a lot of attention in the last couple of years as it was made available, approved in Health Canada in 2016. And in BC, it's been free for folks who qualify, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But in 2018, for particularly like men who have sex with men, but in 2016 for Indigenous folks. And it's a more oral medication. It's taken daily or intermittently by folks who are HIV negative to prevent HIV. There is a long-acting injectable form of PrEP coming down the pipeline, but it's not available yet in Canada. And something important to note about PrEP is that it doesn't prevent or protect you from other STIs, so it's still important to factor that in when you're negotiating safer sex practices, particularly with new partners. And we'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. But when it's used consistently and correctly, PrEP is proven to be very effective at preventing HIV transmission. And the IPREX study showed 85 to 92% effective when PrEP was used consistently and correctly throughout the course of the study. But then the effectiveness dropped off a little bit for folks who were not using it as consistently. But it still provided some protection. So as far as who PrEP is for, really it's, if anybody is interested in PrEP, they should talk to their primary healthcare provider or like somebody at a sexual health clinic that does prescribing. But some of the factors that might make folks consider taking PrEP or would be a history of inconsistent or no condom use, particularly for anal sex. Having multiple sex partners, having had an STI in the last 6 months, having one or more HIV positive partners where their viral load is not detectable or is not known, involvement with sex work, and having repeated cases or courses of PrEP, and we'll talk a little bit more about PEP in a bit. But the eligibility criteria is generally considered what's called the HERE test, and I'm gonna actually, this is in the reference package that we're gonna send, but there's a virtual HERE test that I just put in the chat, and it asks you questions about your sexual history and stuff like that. And it's important to remember when you're filling out the HERE test that you consider the behaviors that you intend to have if you were on PrEP and not necessarily what you're doing now. So you want to estimate like at your most active, and your most, like what do you think would be the sort of highest risk scenario for filling out your HERE test in order to make sure that you qualify if you're really interested in PrEP, because sometimes there's reasons why you might, you might not be considered high enough risk to qualify for free coverage for PrEP, even though it's something that you might feel like it would improve your quality of, sex life and confidence when you're engaging in fun times with fun people. So PrEP is, it can also be like healthcare providers can still provide or prescribe PrEP if you don't meet the HERE score. You just need to actually like have a conversation with them about what your concerns are, and it is something that is possible, although you're going to have probably better experience of that if you're going to like a specialized sexual health clinic than a primary care provider who might not know that much about the process of getting on PrEP, which is something that we're going to talk about in a minute. But PrEP can be used for any gender, but we also understand that PrEP, like HIV, is very poorly researched, particularly in trans folks who are assigned female at birth. And we do know that PrEP is absorbed differently in the innie or frontal or vagina tissue, and it might take longer for it to reach an effective like therapeutic level than in rectal tissue. So the number that I've seen is like at least a week in order for the PrEP medication to reach an effective level in the frontal or vaginal tissue. And with that, adherence is likely more important for PrEP use amongst folks who are assigned female at birth and doing frontal or vaginal or any sex. But it's not really understood how frontal atrophy changes with folks who are on testosterone, and how PrEP impacts, or like how that impacts PrEP and HIV risk. And then just something to note as well is that bottoming in either hole is generally considered higher risk than topping. So that's something that you might factor into considerations about whether PrEP might be right or not for you. And then generally most people are taking daily PrEP, but there is an option to do intermittent PrEP. And so the kind of standard regime for that is taking 2 pills for 2 to 24 hours before you have sex. So 2 of the PrEP pills. And then you take 1 pill a day for as many days as you're having sex. So if you're having like say a Pride weekend or whatever, then you take 1 for every day that you throughout the time that you're having sex. And then you take 1 pill a day for 2 days after your last sex encounter. And you're going to want to talk to your healthcare provider or your PrEP prescriber about your interest in doing intermittent PrEP before getting started, just to make sure that they are able to understand how you're using PrEP and know that you might not be refilling it as often as they might expect, and so that they can give you any other guidance that you might need before getting started with that possibility. And just a note on that is that intermittent PrEP might not work super well, like it's not very well understood for folks who are assigned female at birth, and so generally it's considered not an effective strategy for folks who are assigned female at birth as far as intermittent PrEP. So let's see, I think we need to go. Oh, oops, I shouldn't have read that out loud. So yeah, that's intermittent PrEP. Talking a little bit about risks and side effects. So some folks, it's fairly minimal, but some folks experience headache, abdominal pain, weight loss. Not super common, but it's possible. And a lot of folks who experience these side effects reported that they went away after a while of being on the medication. Some of the more severe but much less common side effects are that if somebody is already HIV positive or becomes HIV positive while they're taking PrEP, there might be risk of drug resistance if they're not being monitored for, you know, how the PrEP is interacting with the new HIV infection. And there's also potential liver problems, particularly for folks who have hepatitis B. So that's a test that they do before prescribing PrEP, is hepatitis B test. There's also, again, very rare, but has occurred with kidney problems or kidney failure. And so that's something that they monitor throughout while you're on PrEP, is your kidney function. And then another effect is too much lactic acid in the blood, which can cause some serious issues if left untreated. So again, talk to your healthcare provider if you have any concerns about side effects or anything like that, or if anything comes up when you first start using PrEP. The process of getting on PrEP. So we already kind of talked through some of this, but you're going to talk to your healthcare provider or a sexual health clinic about your interest in getting on PrEP. They'll give you your HERE test. And yeah, even though any doctor can prescribe PrEP, you might want to go to a sexual health clinic just because they have more experience. They might not, you know, have as much stigma in the decision to, you know, take on PrEP, and they know how it works. But there is a resource that's in the resource handout, but I'm going to put here in the chat as well, that you can take, that's a guidelines from the BC Centre for Excellence from HIV and AIDS for how a primary care provider provides prescribed PrEP and how the process works for them. If you and the clinician decide that PrEP is right for you, you'll be tested for HIV, hepatitis B, kidney function, and other STIs. And then if everything comes back okay on that, you'll be given a prescription for PrEP. And all of the PrEP in BC comes through St. Paul's Hospital currently, and they either ship it to your clinic that you went to or local pharmacy for pickup. And that might take up to a week or two to happen. So you need to kind of factor that into your plans accordingly. And then all the testing and the refills and stuff like that happens in 3-month intervals. So you'll get 3 months worth of PrEP, and then say about two to 3 weeks before you're going to run out of your PrEP, you go back in for testing again, and you get tested for your HIV, kidney function, and STIs. And if everything comes back clear, then you get your new prescription for PrEP, and it's kind of lather, rinse, repeat from there. And then if you do decide to come off of PrEP, that you talk to your prescriber. And for folks who are assigned male at birth, you want to give yourself at least 2 days after your last sex before, before stopping. And then for folks who are assigned male at birth, you want to continue for at least 7 days after your last sex act. So that's the process. As far as where to access PrEP on the island, there's a really great resource called checkyourself.today. I don't know if you want to put that in the chat, Taylor, but that is this lovely map that populates all the different clinics and places that you can go for HIV testing, for PrEP, for treatment, for harm reduction supplies, all sorts of awesome stuff. So if you go there, you can find the closest place to you, and that covers all of BC. And then on the right here, we've got a poster about local current testing options in so-called Victoria. And that includes the AVI West Shore Clinic, and not on here, but the Kool-Aid Clinic has also started seeing people again for testing and PrEP. Island Sexual Health, the STI unit, as well as Get Checked Online for testing only. So there's lots of options there. Right now they're all appointment only. Yeah. And then as far as local data on being on PrEP, you can see that there's actually like, you know, quite significant, quite a significant number of folks who are actually on PrEP, and this was as of 2019. BC average was 30.3 or 30.6% of folks who's ever been on PrEP. So that's kind of cool to see. And then a quick look just at PrEP and STIs, because we talked about that PrEP doesn't actually prevent STIs. And so we can see from this Sex Now data from 2019 that you know, what our average rates of STIs are for various STIs. And then when you factor in folks who have had condomless anal sex within the past 6 months, that increases all of our rates. And then interestingly, folks who have ever been on PrEP are seeing much, much higher rates of STIs, and that there's sort of a number of factors there, but considering that people are being tested more frequently, people might be catching things sooner and catching, you know, more frequently, and then like, yeah, might be testing positive more frequently because they're testing more often. But then there's also the factor that, you know, some attitudes towards like using condoms and other prevention strategies are maybe getting a little bit more lax with folks who are not as concerned about HIV when they're taking PrEP. And so, you know, there might be more incidents of condomless sex happening, but it's still really early on and it's hard to sort of tease apart what's actually going on there. So that's something to kind of watch for in the future. So that was PrEP. And then just quickly, we're going to talk about PEP. So PEP is post-exposure prophylaxis, and it's another potential prevention tool. And it's used for if you think you may have come in contact with HIV. It's available through emergency rooms and sexual health clinics. And that you can find out your local places through checkyourself.ca. But it's a course of medications that goes for usually 28 days for folks who are HIV negative, who have potentially been exposed to HIV in the past 72 hours. So it's got to be within 72 hours of exposure. And you take this medication after your contact. When you go to the emergency department, you'll be asked a series of questions about your HIV transmission risk. And if they determine that you might have had a high-risk encounter, then you'll be given PrEP, or a PEP, sorry. And yeah, it's got to be within 72 hours of your contact. And you have to take the full course of medication for it to be effective. And then it's only intended to reduce risk from one exposure, not multiple exposures. So it's an emergency strategy only. It's not meant for like an ongoing thing. And it hasn't been studied quite as much as PrEP has, but because it's sort of a post-exposure situation and not preventative, but as when taken sort of effectively and consistently, PEP can reduce HIV transmission by 80% or more. So that still is pretty effective. Yeah, and find out where to get it closest to you at checkyourself.ca. So that is PEP. And so Taylor just put the link to the resource, the Google Drive resource list. So if you go in there, we've got the resource list for all of our presentations, but the one for today is the PrEP and U equals U, and it's got all of these lovely links on it. Yeah. Are there any questions before we take a break? No?
Okay, so I think we'll just take a couple minute break. So if you want to run to the washroom or go grab a drink, fill up your water bottle, as I see Piot unscrewing the lid on his. That's great. And then we'll come back and have some time with our lovely panelists. So, yeah, so in terms of our panel discussion, hoping that that first of all, we could get folks just to introduce yourselves and just like give us a little bit of a background in terms of your relationship with HIV. And then we'll move into some of the preset questions that we have all kind of talked about ahead of time. And then if we have time, we can open it up for participants to ask questions if that feels okay. Does that sound all right?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Would you like me to start?
Sure, yeah, thanks, Dawn.
I'm Dawn Cloutier. I live in Victoria. I've been HIV positive, was diagnosed in 1994, along with hepatitis B, hepatitis C, and cancer. And so I'm on the AAA that you mentioned earlier, and I'm undetectable, have been for multiple years, and I'm living well. Grandmother of 4 girls.
Awesome, thanks, Dawn. Who wants to go next?
Can you hear me? Yeah. Okay. My name is Daniel Sands. I'm Two-Spirit. Been HIV positive. Well, I was diagnosed in 2015 at the same time as cancer diagnosis. They were diagnosed in like 2 weeks or about a week of each other. And at the time, I was just before that. Before admitted into the hospital, I was sleeping outside and heavily in my substance use, and now I'm housed, and I've been sober for I think 450 something days now, and yeah, I'm super grateful actually to be HIV positive at the time of 2015 and today, because I mean, people have given their lives and time in the past for me to have a pretty like seamless sort of transition. Like I don't have to go through all the, giant handfuls of meds. There's, people who've died and given their lives for in the past so that I could, I already, when I was diagnosed, already was like well-established AIDS service organizations. There was already community. Like the, 2 other panelists were 2 of the first 2 people that ever helped me through. Like, so that was like actually that was so lovely because it was already established. There was already people there, to kind of guide me through. It wasn't like in the beginning of the AIDS epidemic where there was nobody, no AIDS service organizations, no, you were like, you had to like quit your job because you weren't going to live long. There was no life expectancy, and now HIV positive people have actually a longer life expectancy because we're the drugs are so awesome, and it's quite I'm quite kind of grateful to be HIV positive today. Thanks.
Thanks, Daniel. Piot, you're up.
Sure, yeah, thank you. So I'm Piot. I've been living with HIV, I think for, I keep saying around 10 years, but I've been saying that for a few years now. So a little bit longer than 10 years, but yeah, a lot of the work lately that I've been working on in terms of like the HIV movement has been around criminalization. And so that's something that I'm really interested in, and I'm looking forward to maybe chatting a bit about it if the opportunity comes up.
Awesome. Thanks, Piot. Okay, so we have a series of questions, which all of you have already seen, so no surprises. So yeah, maybe we can just start. I'll read the question, and then whoever wants to kind of jump on it can, and we'll see where we go. So what changes have you noticed in the community in terms of how HIV is perceived and approached? So this can be since you first found out that you were living with HIV, or since the advent of PrEP, or conversations about U equals U. Yeah.
I think I find the most educated people in the community are the youth and people in my age group in the 50s and 60s. However, there's lacking information in the seniors, 60 and over. There's lacking in information between the 20 and 30-year-olds. And I find a lot of fear there.
Interesting. Interesting. Thanks for that, Don.
Yeah, I think there's some like big changes that happen. And Don, what you mentioned, like I see that as well, that there's certain kind of segments of the population who I think are still lacking some of that information. And I think it's been really interesting when we mentioned U equals U, and kind of how differently, or how that really changed the landscape of HIV, and with the kind of advent of meds, and people actually living these fulfilling long lives, I think it's really changed the way that people talk about HIV. I think it changed the way that people engage in their sexual practices and how they identify. And so, yeah, thanks, Don. I would agree with you.
Thank you. Actually, I had an experience a couple of weeks ago. I was cleaning a friend's house, and an elderly gentleman, and he said, "Oh, by the way, you can't ever use my clippers because I don't want to get AIDS." And I went, "Excuse me?" And I had to educate him on that. I know.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, that's shocking. Yeah.
Also, I find that the healthcare professionals that do in-home care are lacking knowledge. I just went through my radiation therapy for the cancer, and I found a lot of fear there. People coming into my homes wanting to put on a full gown, face mask, and eye shield to possibly hold my hand while I climbed in the shower. And I just told them to leave, go out the same door you came in, because I don't want you here. And that was somebody between 25 and 30 years old. A lot of stigma.
Wow, yeah. Yeah, that's what that was going to be my next question, is what do you think that that's about? And yeah.
Yeah, it was even before the COVID.
Yeah.
So there was no excuse, just uneducated.
Wow. Yeah, how disappointing to see that, like, amongst healthcare providers, right?
Oh, I know, because
Yeah.
they're everywhere around here helping the seniors where I live. We've got 175 elderly people here, and you're gonna walk in my door and do that? I'm sorry, not acceptable.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, and I think that speaks to how much work there is still left to do, right? And so I think that oftentimes I hear from people my age or folks that are younger, they kind of think of HIV as this thing that's kind of like, we're past it, you know, there's all this medication now. But I think lots of people tend to forget about the kind of like day-to-day situations, the way that stigma kind of presents itself. to people living with HIV. And I think that there is still quite a lot of fear around HIV. Like the late 80s and early 90s were kind of this really big era where AIDS was kind of like the defining part of it, right? And so people hear HIV, they hear AIDS, and they're still kind of stuck in that kind of 90s mentality when it still was a death sentence and when it still was really scary. And I think there was still a lot of unknowns that we know now. And so it's a matter of kind of trying to figure out how we can disseminate that information and how we can kind of continue letting people know about some of the advances that have happened, so that things like what you just mentioned, Dawn, that's horrific, so that things like that don't happen. But the reality is that they still do. And so I think it just speaks to the work that's left to do on like all of our parts.
Yes, there is so much work left to do, and it's barely even going to touch the surface. You know, it's of all the good things and the wonderful things and the medical professionals, and you know, it's just amazing people that have done so much, and to have those odd few people uneducated.
Yeah.
Sad.
Yeah, I mean, I grew up in the, you know, in the 80s, and so I was, you know, a little kid in the, in the early 80s, and so I kind of grew up with that. And then it wasn't until like whatever, it's been 4 or 5 years now that then I was diagnosed. And when I first was diagnosed, I instantly, you know, thought back to those early days that, you know, the first thing I thought was, oh, I'm going to die. It's over. Right. And then my very quick education through, you know, very quickly in the, you know, next few months really of learning more and going, oh no, actually, like, you know, it was like a fast track of education that I went from I'm going to die, this is the like early 80s, and then to, you know, right into the present where I was like, oh, actually I'm actually going to have a longer lifespan, and, you know, and I'm going to the doctor regularly, and, you know, and there's a whole, you know, there's a whole vast network of people and resources and supports that I had no idea that even existed, right? I had, you know, in my mind that, you know, before my diagnosis, people with HIV, they were just invisible. They just became invisible to me. Where now it's like they're part of this whole group of, you know, fighters and in the resistance, and people who are like, you know, educating people, you know, all the time, and, you know, people who are slaying stigma, and, you know, and I know for me, I'm really empowered to disclose my status, because it's, I know if I hide it, and then there's this like this air of shame. But if I just, like, you know, proudly declare that I'm HIV positive, it's like people can't shame me for it, because I'm super proud of it, right? And, you know, and I'm just out there and I declare it, and then, you know, then it also opens up a conversation, right? Like if I was like nervous and scared to disclose, I'm bringing that nervous and scared energy into the conversation. And then people, I think, can, you know, I think it almost can fuel stigma sometimes. But I mean, it's different for everybody too, right? But like for me, it's, you know, it's like being bullied for being a gay kid. You know, when I just said, yeah, you're right, then, you know, they didn't have anything else to do. They could keep trying, but it was like, no. Wow, you said the truth. Oh, ouch! You know, it's just a tool that I've used to you know, dispel stigma in a lot of ways. It's just owning it and making a conversation, like, you know, and I think, you know, lots, and I've that's things that I've learned from other HIV positive folks who've been positive for years and years and years and decades, right? You know, and that even that there's a thing of, you know, HIV and aging. That's a thing, you know, in the early 80s, nobody thought that would have been a thing. Like, you know, how do you age, you know, with, you know, try to figure out what's aging or what's HIV or what's both, or, you know, trying to navigate those things. That's a thing. That's pretty awesome, you know, where, you know, years ago it wasn't even imagined. So yeah, there's lots of, you know, awesome strides. There's like I think everything, there's always work to be done, because there's always going to be a, you know, urban myths and you know, different things that get passed on, that misinformation. But I think, you know, being able to dispel that misinformation is, yeah, I think it's kind of a burden that most HIV positive folks carry, but, you know, it's part of the job, I think.
I found one of the best places to have a conversation was riding the bus on my way to my volunteer work at PWA, and I'd wear the red ribbon, and just that red ribbon, well, what does that stand for? And all of a sudden 6 or 8 people are joining in on a conversation about HIV and AIDS, and it was amazing. Yeah.
Mm.
Wow, that's so cool. Yeah, that's great.
Mm.
Yeah, so kind of moving on to the next question. Some of you have already touched on this, but just to kind of focus in on it again, what are your experiences with treatment, and how has it changed since you first found out you were HIV positive?
I think it's the shortest story. So when I first started, yeah, I was taking one pill once a day and 2 pills twice, or 1 pill twice a day, and that was it. And then just recently, in the past year, I've switched to a one pill a day, and yeah, I have no side effects. Yeah, so it's been pretty smooth.
Back in 1994, they put me on the interferon for 3 months. I thought I was going to die just from the side effects. I had to take 2 other medications along with it. And yeah, I was basically crawling around my house. I couldn't even go outside. But back then, they let your CD4 count get below 250 before they put you on the medication. So you were double whammied. But since then, they've come out, and like I said, I'm on the Atripla, 1 pill a day, take it religiously, and undetectable.
Wow, what a huge difference. It sounds like. Yeah. Thanks for sharing that, Dawn.
Oh, I guess it's my turn. Yeah, so I mean, treatment is like, I find it such an interesting thing. And so for me, I think like when I tested positive, it was kind of right on the cusp of when they were trying to decide whether treatment right away is the right thing to do, or whether to wait until the CD4 goes down a bit. And so I chose to wait for a couple of years, mostly because I was like still partying a lot and I didn't know how those medications would interact with some of my fun times. But yeah, I found it really interesting. I've been on quite a number of different treatments just based on like resistance to certain meds and then side effects for other meds. But one thing that I'm always kind of really grateful for is knowing that there's so many more treatments that are available. So I think I'm on my 4th round of treatments, and I know that, you know, at some point I might become resistant, or I might develop some sort of organ issues that might make me change meds. But I know that there's plenty of options out there right now, and there's always increasing options. Like Marshall, you mentioned that long-acting PrEP, and that might actually be a long-acting HIV treatment as well, which I find is really exciting. So there's always new things coming out. Hopefully like one day it will be like a once a year shot that I get in my butt and then I don't have to think about it. But yeah, I think the reality with treatment is that you're constantly reminded when you're taking those meds, right? Like med fatigue is definitely a thing. And so I've experienced that over the years, kind of just getting frustrated about actually having to take meds, but there's always new things coming up.
Thanks, Piot. Yeah, that's a really great point, right? Like when you think about too, like how much things have changed, like, you know, thinking about like Dawn's experience, right? Like how much things have changed over that period of time, to the point where like now, you know, you're taking 1 pill a day as opposed to your experience before. And so yeah, you're right. There are always new things that are being developed, and hopefully better and better treatments, you know, over time.
Yeah, and I think like one of the big challenges around treatment right now is like equitable access to it, right? So I think before, when it was kind of, there was a limited amount of meds, they were really expensive. I think the focus now needs to be on like ensuring that, you know, pharmaceutical companies aren't patenting new technology and making kind of meds accessible more so than they have been, and ensuring that people who need meds kind of have access to them and they don't cost thousands of dollars. And
Absolutely. Great point. Okay, the next question we have is, how have U equals U and or PrEP impacted you? Just, I don't know, in terms of your life, sex, relationships, confidence, any way that it's impacted you, or maybe it hasn't impacted you. I don't know. Who's to say?
Well, I did a video testimonial for the Public Health Agency of Canada to promote U equals U. So that was pretty impactful. They came to my house and interviewed with cameras and stuff, and interviewed me and my mom, and there's the video online, and so that was pretty cool. And then afterwards, they flew my mom and I to Ottawa for a few days to take part in a roundtable discussion with a whole bunch of executive directors from like the CDRC, the community-based research, the Canadian Aboriginal AIDS Network, like, you know, all these executive directors, and me and my mom. It was pretty fun. That was pretty cool. But one of the things I wanted to say about U equals U was, for me, was just learning about it. I kind of like learned what U equals U was, and then asked my doctor, and he was like, "Oh no, you've been undetectable for years because you were like nobody really." I was like, "Well, where's my parade? Where's my, you know, where's the balloons and confetti? I want a celebration. I want a, you know, I want a cake or something." Like, it's a big. I thought it was pretty, you know, it's a pretty remarkable thing. And for me, it there's a couple things. Different sexual activities, especially like the low risk ones, it really changed. It really changed everything. Like when I first was diagnosed, I didn't have sex. I was on chemo and radiation too, so that makes it kind of losing all my hair and stuff. There's kind of that changed a bit. But after the chemo and radiation and stuff, when I was feeling better, and then once I learned I was undetectable, that really like kind of liberated me, because I was really nervous about having sex after my diagnosis. Even though the steroid that I was on for chemo and radiation made me really horny, but I was really nervous about having sex. So it really just lessened a lot of my fears around it. And then the other thing was about disclosing my HIV status, like on a legal perspective, right? That you know, if I was undetectable, there's sort of different kind of things, whether it's like a legal thing or not. But I just felt that sort of legal pressure was taken off, because there is, you know, there are laws that, you know, if you don't disclose and you're, you know, have high risk activities and stuff like that, there could potentially be legal consequences. I mean, who needs that going into a date? Like, it's already, you know, difficult to have a date and, you know, navigate all that kind of stuff. But to throw in like legal consequences if you don't reveal your status, it's just like such a buzzkill. So the U equals U really kind of helped that. Like it really made me feel much more relaxed, and you know that I was actually more approachable. Yeah, it helps. Yeah.
I believe for me that it's not about the sexual part of my life. It's about the people in my life, the grandchildren and the family and the friends. And if I cut my hand in the sink of dishes, or maybe a glass broke, or I cut it on a knife, I don't have to bleach everything. I don't have to run and say, don't touch my blood, everybody, you know. I'm undetectable. You can't get it. You just can't get it. And I just take the normal precautions as anybody in the whole world would do. And that just gives me peace of mind and that comfort I need. I can run out and play with the grandkids, and well, the youngest one is 6, my oldest one is 21. So I've been through a lot of owies and lumps and bumps and nicks and cracks and, you know, cuts and bruises. And yeah, it's a good feeling. I'm undetectable. You can't get it.
Thank you, Dawn. That's awesome.
Yeah, I might like complicate it a little bit. So I'm trying to figure out how to say this. So one thing I find about U equals U that is so unbelievably exciting is how it's like empowered people to kind of have no shame about their sexual life. It empowered them to kind of have these like relationships with people without having to fear this idea of harming them. And I think that's one of the most important pieces of U equals U. And I think, you know, I've heard from so many people, Daniel, like you mentioned, Dawn, like you mentioned, how valuable knowing that is for your own interactions with others. One of the challenges that I do have with U equals U, and I think largely kind of a result of the medicalization of HIV positive people is that focus of it still being on transmittability, right? And so I think one of the longest kind of never-ending narratives around HIV positive people is that they're still always positioned as a risk to the public. And so something that helps mitigate that risk is kind of practices like U equals U. But what it doesn't really do is challenge that fundamental idea that HIV positive folks are vectors of disease, or that there's somehow a risk to others. And so while I really appreciate what U equals U has done for a lot of people, including myself, and kind of being able to have these sexual relationships with people and not have to worry about transmitting or harming them, I'm still focusing so much on that transmission piece, right? And I'm still focusing so much on the fact that my body can somehow be weaponized against other people, or the assumption that positive bodies can be weaponized against other people. And so I find it's this kind of like double-edged sword where on one hand, it's really useful and it's great. It's this new development. It's fantastic. On the other hand, it still really focuses on transmittability as someone's value. And so I'm always trying to figure out ways to kind of make that a little bit different. Like in lots of ways, I wish that like people would be like, you're undetectable, which means you're going to have better like health outcomes as opposed to like, you're undetectable, you're not going to transmit it to anybody. So it's very complicated. And I do really, I do feel really conflicted about it, but also it's a great thing. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think, and thank you for that. And I think it's so important to be critical, right? Too. And I'm really glad that you raised those points. And I think something that I've heard talked about as well is like, just, yeah, like kind of the valuation, like that some, like the idea that like someone's worth is somehow validated by the fact that they're undetectable. Well, what about like folks who like aren't undetectable, right? And like, what does that say then about those folks? And like, you know, how does that piece kind of fit into things?
Yeah, and I think of like one of the campaigns that I think has been, in my opinion, like one of the most beautiful campaigns in the HIV positive movement is the Love Positive Women movement. And I find that one is for me, that's kind of where that advocacy comes in, where it's talking about like loving someone who is positive regardless of all of these other factors that exist, regardless of their ability to be able to transmit it or not. It's this kind of focus on the human, which I've really appreciated about that campaign. And it's kind of more of this desire to be like, hey, positive folks are human, positive folks deserve love, they deserve healthy sexual and platonic and romantic relationships, regardless of their ability to transmit or not. And also just focusing on the idea that there's other prevention methods that exist that also lead to being unable to transmit something, right? Like I recognize that undetectability is a standalone intervention, but there's also other ones for detectable people. And I think the focus needs to be on centering the person and not so much their ability to transmit or not.
Awesome. Thank you. Yeah, I think that's great. Did I ask the last one or did you, Marshall? I can't keep track.
You did, so I guess I'll do the next one.
Okay.
So I guess we'll drill down a little bit more to what are your thoughts on PrEP, and how will it change things for you in the community moving forward?
I think a little bit of like a liberation in a way. You know, there's like liberation from, you know, fear and different things like that. I mean, I haven't had any sort of direct experience with it, but yeah, I think there can be a bit of an empowerment and stuff like that. But yeah.
I'm aware of PrEP. I know about PrEP. If the time comes, I can use that information and share it. And yeah, I'm so glad it's there.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm excited about PrEP too. I think like one of the things I find is really exciting about PrEP is that it actually allows for negative people to like kind of take responsibility for their own sexual health, which is kind of a different thing that existed for a long time, right? People always assume that the positive person is the one who needs to be responsible for the negative person's sexual health. And so in that sense, I think it's really exciting. And like, I wish that PrEP was around when I was negative, and I think I would have really benefited from it. But similar to undetectability, I think it has this really interesting dynamic that happened. Like and just from a personal experience, I kind of went on a date with this guy who kind of refused to make out with me or refused to kind of engage in any sort of physical activity because he was waiting for PrEP and he was going through the process of getting PrEP. And I thought that was a really interesting, I thought it was really interesting because it was kind of this thing where I was like, okay, I can't transmit the virus anyways, but and I don't know how to say it without kind of denying this person's experience, because for him it was a very important part of engaging in a physical relationship. But it kind of made me think about how like interesting that's become now, right? Where it's kind of like, you know, some people are kind of doubling up on PrEP and undetectability, and that's kind of, yeah, I find it interesting. I'm really stoked. I'm really excited about it. And there's certain parts about it that still make me feel a bit weird. Like it almost takes away this kind of ability to have this navigation with people. Like I've chatted with people before where they're like, oh yeah, I'm on PrEP, and that's kind of the end of it. There's no further discussion about like what we might like to do, like what things that we might be interested in. It's almost this kind of like end all that's happened. And I think in that sense, it's kind of unfortunate. It's kind of taken away that ability to have this really fruitful discussion about boundaries and about pleasure. And also it's so valuable as a tool.
For sure. And I think that like that, yeah, I mean, I appreciate, Piot, that you're able to like talk, like you're talking about basically like that there is nuanced, right? And it's complicated, and there are all of these shades of gray kind of with these new like things that are available in the community. And I think one thing that comes to mind, like hearing you talk about that experience, is how like PrEP does not replace the need for anti-stigma education in the community, right? Like that, I think, because like, I mean, of course, people are like absolutely entitled to their boundaries and like can negotiate like what feels good for them in terms of engaging with a person like in any way. And also kissing someone is never a risk for HIV transmission. So to me, like what that would indicate is that like that is something that's fueled perhaps by stigma more so than accurate information. And, you know, like being on PrEP doesn't take away that issue, right? So I might be biased though. Yeah.
Yeah.
No, for sure. Yeah.
It's almost like you have this checklist when you meet somebody. Do you have COVID-19? No. Okay, check. Do you have HPV? Yes. Okay. Do you have HIV? I'm positive, but you're negative. And the list goes on and on and on. It's yeah.
Mm-hmm.
It's kind of funny in a way.
Mm-hmm. Totally.
Absolutely.
I can speak a little bit about like as the perspective of somebody who's used PrEP. If folks are interested too, like I've used PrEP. I'm not currently using it because of COVID and not having sex, but I found that it really it made me feel a lot more liberated in my sexual experiences, and like particularly when you know, when I was having more sort of promiscuous periods of time and stuff like that. Like it really put my mind at ease, particularly around like engaging with condomless sex and stuff like that. And yeah, it made me feel more empowered in the sex that I was having. And like Piot said, you know, it was kind of a way of me taking responsibility for my own sexual health as well. And that felt really good too. And that like, you know, yeah, that it's my health and it's my body too, and that like, you know, other people realistically shouldn't be responsible for my health. And you know, knowing what I know about you know, HIV transmission and U equals U, and you know, different methods of transmission, like you know, I knew that like folks who were you know, HIV positive and undetectable, like, and knew and could communicate that status to me, you know, were not of concern to me, you know, like that it's not, you know, it's folks who don't necessarily know that, that I need to be thinking about. And for me, taking the step to take PrEP and cover that for myself felt really, yeah, just empowering to be able to have the sex that I want to have without that kind of like lingering thing in the background that is a constant worry. And like for myself, you know, I think about being like a queer trans man, and particularly like, you know, predominantly having sex with male identified folks, that like, you know, it's just this worry about adding this other thing that people aren't going to be okay with, you know. And like for me, that also put a lot of my mind at ease, just like knowing that, you know, I get past the hurdle of like, are you okay with me being trans? You know, are you still attracted to me because I'm fat? And then add on HIV on top of that. And it's something that like, you know, did cause some stress and consideration when I was thinking about the sex that I was having, particularly at times when I was taking higher risks than some people might choose to. So yeah, it's definitely had a positive impact on my life. Yeah.
Thanks, Marshall. So we have a couple minutes left. I think we've kind of covered everything that we had in our predetermined questions. So does anyone else want to ask any questions for our panelists? And you could put them in the chat, or you can unmute yourself.
Can I just mention something that I find is really interesting?
Yeah, absolutely.
Dawn, I thought something you mentioned that I've been thinking about lately is when you were talking about, like, do you have COVID? and I find that COVID is actually like a really interesting display of how stigma can kind of just like happen. And one thing I'm always thinking about is like the way that people are navigating risk with COVID, and how there's almost like this level of shame and blame that's happening with COVID as well. That's similar to STIs, right? Like, did you not wear a mask when you went to the store? And I think it's really interesting because it's thrown everyone into this like really interesting dynamic where they're having to like navigate their relationships with others. Like, how small is your bubble? Or like, are you washing your hands and things like that? And I just think it's so interesting because like there's going to be that like scenario potentially where like, you know, someone you know or someone you might know gets COVID. And I think the reaction is always to be like, well, how did you get that COVID? or like, what did you do? And I just find it's a really interesting comment you mentioned. Yeah.
Thank you, Piat. I love that one because it's everywhere. It's, yeah, you're dealing with it every day. And it's like, people are tired of wearing the mask, but you know what? When I got tested for COVID last week and I'm negative, I was so happy. So yeah, I'm wearing my mask.
And just to do a little plug on that, we've got our session on COVID and sex coming up on August 10th, which is our next workshop in the series. So come on down for that conversation.
Are you going to talk about glory holes?
I mean, how can we not? They would be like negligent if we didn't talk about glory holes, and boring also.
The funny thing is that we've got one of the nurses from BC CDC coming to talk about COVID and sex, and in our email exchange, she actually like shared, before I had seen the link about the article that was going around about glory holes, he shared it and was like, yeah, we're getting a fair bit of attention on our recent guidelines. And I was just like, yeah, so he's already on it. He's going to talk about glory holes. So we're down. Yeah.
Tune in next week for glory holes.
Not next week, the week after.
The week after.
It's holiday,
yeah,
holiday
right.
weekend. So no workshop next week.
All right. Okay, thank you so much to the panelists. Really, really super appreciate you sharing. And yeah, just like so much respect, so interesting, so much insight that you had to share. So thank you. Thank you so much. Yay!
Yay.